I'm Jonathan Avila, Chief Accessibility Officer at LevelAccess, and today we'll be talking about the value of a VPAT. We want to provide this informative session to help you accelerate your business-to-business sales with proof of product accessibility. Let me introduce you to our panelists who will be joining me today. As again, I'm John Avila, Chief Accessibility Officer at LevelAccess, and I will be joined by my colleagues, Ritu and Justine. Would you please introduce yourselves?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Ritu Jain. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a brown woman with straight black hair and black eyes. I'm a senior manager here at LevelAccess, and I'm very excited to be here today.
And hello, everyone. My name is Justine Beretta. My pronouns are she, hers, and I am a Caucasian female with straight dark brown hair and dark brown eyes, and I am a team lead and accessibility consultant here at Level.
Wonderful, thank you. It's just a brief introduction to LevelAccess. LevelAccess is the market leader in digital accessibility solutions. We've been in the business for over 25 years. I've been with the company for almost all of that time, so it's very exciting to see the industry change. LevelAccess takes a holistic approach to digital accessibility. We want to make sure that all experiences are accessible to people with disabilities, and we do that by working with businesses, both small and large, by integrating our platform solution along with our expert accessibility people in our organization to assist you in your accessibility goals. We have many trusted partners, including United, Adobe, Walmart, NASA, and different industries across business, government, and education. Well, let's get started. In today's session, we want to focus on an introduction to the VPAT format, what that is, Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. We'll be talking about the different versions of the VPAT format and the different editions, as well as what process you'll need to go through in order to create a successful VPAT report. Then we'll share some of the frequently asked questions that we get from customers and that you're probably wondering yourselves. And then we have a few key takeaways that will start you on your journey. And then we'll have time for Q&A after that. So let's introduction to what a VPAT. Why do you need a VPAT? What is a VPAT? And how can it benefit your organization when you are selling your products and services? Let's look at that now. As I mentioned, a VPAT is a voluntary product accessibility template. And I stress voluntary, but in order sometimes to sell into an organization, they may require it. So the document itself is voluntary, but it may be a requirement if you're selling into an organization. Now, the template in that, what that means is that it's a document that you fill out, and it provides accessibility documentation often used in market research around information and communication technology. So what is information and communication technology? That's just a way of saying things like websites, mobile apps, software, hardware, things like printers and point of sale machines, to documentation and also support services and documentation. So those are some of the examples of the products and services that could be used, that you can use the VPAT format to document their level of accessibility. Now, the term VPAT, I've been using that because that's what a lot of people are familiar with. The VPAT is the template. It's a template in Word format. But when you complete that template, you are creating what is known as an Accessibility Conformance Report, or ACR. So that ACR is the output of completing the VPAT template. Now, originally, the template was developed by ITI and with assistance from the US federal government to assist federal agencies in their Section 508 obligations to procure accessible technology. And the goal was to create something that agencies could use in market research to compare the accessibility of different products. So agencies were tasked with buying the most accessible product that meets the business needs of the agency. And so they needed a way to sort of compare products because people purchasing things aren't experts in accessible technology. And so they needed some sort of documentation to sort of understand how accessible are the products I'm buying and how do they compare to other products on the market. Now this format is more widely used to measure or to show conformance across a number of standards, both in the US and in many countries, including the EU. So now it's become more of a global document that is used to in procurement to describe the level of accessibility a product has. There's not a lot of other documents out there that do something similar. So this is pretty much widely used. But there's some situations where you don't need a VPAT and some situations where you do, and we will get you that information today during the webinar. So what is a VPAT template look like? If you're not familiar with a template, you're probably saying, okay, what does it look like? How can I fill it out? Those types of questions, those are all great questions. So when you complete a template, you end up with an ACR. I have an example on the screen here. And what it basically says is what company it's for, what product it's for, what version of the template. There's a couple of different versions we'll cover today. What is the date of the report, and then some information about the product, about contact information. So if someone has a question about this document, and then there's some other additional information such as how was the level of conformance determined? What evaluation methodology was used to make that determination of conformance? And there's also a room for notes where you could document perhaps what was covered, what aspects were covered, what was the scope of this conformance report. And then after that, there's a table that lists what are the standards covered. So is it WCAG standards, Section 508 standards, et cetera. And then each of the criterion from those standards are listed in these tables. And each table has 3 columns. One is the standard that you are documenting conformance to. The second column is your level of conformance, and that is whether it supports, does not support, or partially supports. And then the last column, and you can also have non-applicable. And then the last column is related to explanation or remarks. So if you say something supports, well, what does that mean? Or if you say something partially supports, what does that mean? What does it mean? Like, what is the impact? What meets and what doesn't meet? And how can you demonstrate that it meets? How can you? So the point of this document is to show how these criteria are met. And so this section is a great opportunity to document the good things your products are doing, as well as calling out the things that you're working on to improve. So that's an overview of the format. Let's then look at, next, we'll look at the why would you want to complete an ACR VPAT format? Why would you do it? When do you need to do it or not? So most public sector entities, so government, state and local government, federal government, whether it be US or EU, different nations, most public sector bodies have accessibility obligations they need to meet. They need to be compliant. And so in the US, federal government, for example, they have to meet Section 508 standards. Many state and local governments have Section 508-like requirements as well. Some more recent laws in Colorado, and also Maryland, for example, has instructional material requirements. A lot of those laws may actually call out that a VPAT document is needed whenever a state or a school system or public entity makes a purchase. And so if you want to sell into those organizations, you will want to have a VPAT ready so you can sell into those organizations. Now, beyond public entities, we are finding more and more businesses also requesting VPAT documentation as well on the level of accessibility. So private sector organizations are included in that. And so when we have an annual state of digital accessibility survey that we do every year, and I highly recommend reading through it. But what we found from senior leaders was that 73% of those surveyed found that accessibility was a procurement requirement in at least most of the time. So there's a need with those B2B businesses as well. And there's some laws out there that are being proposed, for example, in California, which may require businesses who sell to other businesses to meet accessibility obligations and be held accountable. So the industry is changing. There's litigation out there, and so it's really important to make sure that you are thinking about accessibility and documenting that in industry standard ways. In addition, there's to the legal risks that I just mentioned, there's also DE&I commitments that some organizations have. Organizations need to be accessible to their own employees. And so as part of that, many large organizations have accessibility requirements. They require their vendors. If you want to sell into Microsoft, if you want to sell into other organizations, you need to provide accessible software and a VPAT format, VPAT document to show your level of conformance. So now let's take a quick second to ask my colleagues, Justine and Ritu, why do our customers want an ACR? What are we hearing?
So it depends. Sometimes customers come in right away and they say, we want an ACR, so let's do our audit and get that written. Other times, customers come in and they're just looking to improve accessibility, they're looking for an audit, and then along the line, they'll come back and say, oh, we have a potential customer who's requested an ACR. Can you help us do that? And Ritu, how about you?
Yeah, totally. We have many clients who reach out to us and request VPAT because they want to be proactive and focus on accessibility to ensure everyone can use their products and also to avoid potential lawsuits.
Excellent. Those are just some of the reasons, and we'll probably bring up more during our discussion today. Next. So what is the history of the VPAT format? It's been around for, gosh, over 20 years. Originally, as I mentioned, an initiative from ITI in GSA in 2001. Back then, it was really aimed at Section 508 and the Section 508 standards. However, in 2017, that's when Section 508 was refreshed to include WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, at that time 2.0. And so the format was updated at that time to cover those standards. And so it is updated on a regular basis as new standards come out. So for example, as WCAG 2.2 came out in October of this past year, the VPAT format was updated to the latest version, which is version 2.5. And that covers WCAG 2.2, European standards, and Section 508 standards. So it is updated, and you'll probably know that WCAG 2.2 had a few changes, and we'll cover those things that are then reflected in the VPAT document on the next slide. Okay, VPAT 2.5. So let's talk about the latest version of the VPAT format and whether you need to go to that format if you have a VPAT now. So let's jump into that. So the additions of the VPAT format. So there's 4 formal editions. So they're all version 2.5 right now. The latest versions were published. I think they're from October, but they were dated November, posted on the ITI website. So ITI has these documents template, and the template consists of a few things. It can consist of a few pages of instructions to help you fill out the document. And then the second half of the document is the applicable tables and information that we discussed earlier. And so depending on which standards you need to meet, you'll want to choose the appropriate edition. And I would also preface this by saying, in order to create an ACR, that's the conformance report, you have to audit your product. You have to perform an accessibility evaluation of your product. Most public entities, most people would also say that you have to perform an evaluation that includes both manual and automated testing, and likely includes testing by users with disabilities and testing with assistive technology as well. So keep that in mind before you actually complete the document. You need to know, what are my applicable standards? And you then need to select the appropriate edition after you've done your audit, so you can document that. And so what are the different editions? And so the first one is the Section 508 edition. This is aimed at the US federal government and those selling into the government. And WCAG 2.2 is only what's required right now. Probably will stay at that, but who knows? WCAG 2.0 is what's required by the US federal government, broadly speaking. 2.2 is the current version. So the US government is a few editions back on WCAG. And then Section 508 includes additional requirements beyond WCAG for things like authoring tool capability. So for example, if your website allows you to create content you can share with others, that's an authoring tool. So an example that might be like social media or email or word processing and things like that. The other sections that it includes are things like software. So things like mobile apps are software. The Section 508 version includes standards for hardware, documentation. So if you are selling those things like hardware, software into the US government, and you will want to fill out the 508 version, or potentially one of the international version, which I'll get to in just a moment. In addition to the 508 version, we have the WCAG version, and that is just the WCAG success criteria. And that includes WCAG 2.0, 2.1, and 2.2. And so the way WCAG works, if you are conformant to WCAG 2.0, you're also conformant to 2.1 and backwards conformant to 2.0 as well. So each version of WCAG has sort of built on itself on the previous versions. And so they contain the same requirements with one removal in version 2.2. So the idea is that if you just need to conform to WCAG, maybe you have a customer in the private sector or a customer who just is in the public sector who's just concerned about WCAG, then that probably is the best version for you. Now, if you sell into the EU and you want to meet Europe's EN 301549 standard, then you may want to fill out the EU version or the international version. Now, the VPAT format is not as widely used in Europe today as it is in North America, but I believe it will probably become more common with businesses who want to use one format. They want to have one set of standards they're testing for, and so they don't want to create multiple different types of documents. And so this format will likely be useful if you're selling into EU public sector, or perhaps if you want to support the EU Accessibility Act, which is coming into force in June of 2025, so June of next year. And currently the EU version includes WCAG 2.1, as well as the European standards, as I mentioned. And then lastly, the fourth version, that's that international version. And that includes Section 508, the EU accessibility standards, and WCAG. Now, what's nice about this version is if you want to report on 508 and WCAG 2.1 or 2.2, you would need to use this international version because the 508 version doesn't have WCAG 2.1 or 2.2 in it. So this is where the international version is very flexible. You can use this to report on the relevant standards. So we often find customers who who need to meet 508 and report on all of 508, but they also need to report on 2.1 and 2.2 because they're selling into a state or a federal agency that may require more. So I was recently talking with the USDA, Department of Agriculture in the US. They say they follow 508, but they require WCAG 2.2. So this would be a great fit for that situation if you're selling into that customer. Next. So a little bit more about 2.5. I alluded to this earlier. Like, what are some of the differences? What's new in 2.5? The primary takeaways is that 2.2, WCAG 2.2 is covered in the international version and in the WCAG version. And so that's really the biggest difference. And then I would also say that this is the first time in history, but that one of the success criterion from WCAG, which is 411 parsing, was removed in 2.2. So one of the criterion was removed, and it is also considered met backwards compatible to 2.1 and 2.0. That means you don't have to report on it anymore, and you get an automatic supports for this particular criterion. So this is really great. This criterion probably just created a lot of extra testing work, didn't really address accessibility needs of people with disabilities, unless but if there was an issue with that impacted a user's ability to use assistive technology, then it would likely fail one of the other criteria. So because of that, this one was removed in WCAG. And so this format is essentially mirroring the changes that the W3C did in WCAG 2.2. And so it's following that. And so that's the main difference. You're probably saying, okay, if I have a VPAT format, say I have a VPAT that's using 2.4, do I need to update that? Is it out of date? Is it suddenly obsolete? And the answer is no, it's not obsolete. It may still be useful, still may be used, but this is a great opportunity to look at the new format, to test to WCAG 2.2, to look at some of the new requirements that may be required by your customers. Sometimes you may have a customer that says they want a very specific version of the VPAT, and so you may need to update it if they say they require 2.5, for example, or they require WCAG 2.2, then you would have to update it. But otherwise, you could probably continue to use it for a little bit while longer. But I would say the industry standard and best practice is starting to become WCAG 2.2. So we encourage people to start thinking about how you can meet WCAG 2.2 by anytime you are updating or designing new content, you want to start thinking about that. Okay, so I'm now going to pass it to my colleague Justine to talk about the VPAT process and how you would go about planning for VPAT.
Thank you, John. So like John said, we've covered the what is a VPAT. We've covered why organizations would want to get a VPAT. And then we've also touched on what's new in VPAT 2.5. So next we're going to move on to the how. How exactly do organizations go about completing a VPAT? And so before even getting started, first you're going to want to decide, is completing a VPAT right for your organization, or are you going to benefit from some other form of accessibility documentation? So of course, if you need to conform to specific accessibility standards, Section 508, EN 301, 549, then absolutely you're going to want to go the standardized route. You're going to want to complete a VPAT. But if you just want to demonstrate your organization's commitment to accessibility, then doing some sort of documentation like an accessibility statement and posting that on your website could be a good alternative as well. They both have similarities, like accessibility statements, in addition to having, a statement explaining your dedication to making your product accessible. You're also going to include information about contact information for a person or maybe a team that's responsible for answering questions about accessibility, which is the same thing that we also do in page 1 of the VPAT. So it's usually not a general support service. It's going to be someone or a team that can answer questions specifically about if someone's trying to fill out a form on your site and they're not able to, and they're using a screen reader, or they're using voice control technology like Dragon, those sorts of questions. It's also going to communicate the standard that you adhere to, if it's WCAG 2.1, 2.2, those are the most common. But then, so say you've determined that you want to go the standardized route, and then you want to complete a VPAT. Your next step, or the first real step in completing a VPAT, is to identify the standards you want to conform to. A lot of the times we advise, look at what standards your buyers have to conform to. If you're selling to a government organization in the United States, you're probably going to need to conform to Section 508. If you're doing business in Europe and your customers need to adhere to that standard, then you're probably going to want to go for a VPAT that is going to meet that standard of the European standard. Or sometimes people don't necessarily need to adhere to a specific standard, but they want to demonstrate that they're meeting WCAG. So then they'll go for the WCAG standard of either 2.1 or now more frequently 2.2, because that's the most up-to-date one. So after you've identified the standards that you want to conform to, then you're going to identify the scope of coverage. So what is your VPAT going to be for? Is it going to be one specific product, or is it going to be maybe discussing multiple VPATs for multiple products that your organization makes? So you're going to want to identify what this is going to cover. Then step 3, identify which VPAT edition to use. And this is mostly going to be informed by step 1, because if you need to adhere to Section 508, then you're going to want the VPAT template, like John was saying, that has Section 508. So a lot of times it'll be like the combined WCAG Section 508 one. If you are doing business internationally and your customers, some need 508, some need the EN 301549, then maybe the international edition is the best fit for you, because that way you're not locked into one region and you can sell across regions from there. So then the most time-consuming part of the VPAT process is to evaluate your product's accessibility and then remediate issues. And this is the most time-consuming. It usually actually takes a little bit more time than people think that it will, because you have to thoroughly evaluate your product against all of the standards that you've selected. So you're doing like a WCAG template, but all of them have WCAG incorporated. So if you're going to do it with WCAG, Section 508, EN 301, you're going to evaluate your product against all of those criteria. And it is a time-consuming process. So you're going to make a plan on how to do that. And then after the fact, when you're done evaluating your product, you may find that there are things that are not accessible or are not meeting the standards, some of the standards that you thought it would. And instead of going right to writing a VPAT, you're going to take a moment to go have your team fix those issues and then go back and reevaluate your product before writing a VPAT. And this is something that we run into sometimes, where people come in and they say, I want an audit, I want a VPAT. And so we'll go straight through, author the VPAT, and then what they find is that there's a little bit more partially supports and does not support than they were anticipating. And then they want to go back and remediate and fix things, and then get that reauthored to have a more favorable report. So when you're filling out, once you've evaluated your product, you've decided, you fix the issues that you found, and then now you're ready to sit down and write your ACR. Some key things to keep in mind: you want to always use the accepted terminology. So supports, partially supports, does not support. If you're doing the Section 508 and 301, then not evaluated may come into play as well. Also keep in mind that depending on your product, not every success criteria may apply to your product. So like, for example, 1.2.4 captions live is specific to live real-time synchronized media. So if your product doesn't do something like a live stream type of thing, then that's not going to apply to your product. So when you're filling out Table 2 of WCAG and you get to 1.2.4, that's going to get us supports because you don't have captions. It meets that criteria. You don't have a need for captions, I should say. So then from there, you go through, write, your findings of the conformance level, and then you have your ACR written. Next is you're going to make sure that your ACR is accessible. And this is an important step that not everyone remembers, but it is important because if you spend all of this time making sure that your product is accessible and then your ACR isn't accessible, then it kind of calls into question a little bit of like the credibility. So always make sure when you're finished writing your VPAT and you're making it the accessible ACR, whatever format, especially if you're exporting to a PDF, always go evaluate it, make sure it's accessible, because there's usually a few things that need to be fixed in Acrobat there. So after that is finished, then you're going to next want to establish processes to sustain accessibility over time, right? Because there's going to be updates to your product, things are going to change. So you want to make sure that as you're making updates and changes to your product, you're also checking to make sure that your product is still accessible. It's still meeting all of the standards and requirements that it needs to as well. And so that is a very quick summary of the VPAT process. And it is a long process. And I know it can sound complicated, but we've written a lot of VPATs, and a number of our colleagues here have as well. So it's a long process, but an experienced third-party vendor can support you with this process. And what's also nice is that having a third party do this also will help make your VPAT more reputable to buyers and also lends credibility to it as well. And so to discuss more of the process part of the VPAT is going to be Ritu.
Thank you, Justine. So once you have that ACR, the next question you'll most likely have is, when should I update the ACR? We have some best practices that we recommend to our clients to keep the ACR current and updated. So first thing we say is try to update your ACR at least annually. It doesn't matter when you do it, but have it scheduled. Plan to go through this document at least once a year and update it so that it's most current and up to date. Next, update whenever your product changes significantly. For example, when the user interface gets a major facelift, or you have added new features, or you have reorganized your content. Those are the times to take another look at your VPAT and make necessary changes. Another time when you would think about updating is when accessibility standards change. Whenever that happens, you would want to refresh it with new or additional standards. So always keep your ACR current and accurate. There are clear benefits to doing so. When buyers look at your product, they lean heavily on your ACR to judge whether your product meets their needs. So keeping it current shows that you are serious about making your product accessible. Outdated ACRs may be regarded by them as obsolete or unreliable. In fact, in many cases, ACRs over 2 years old or one that does not cover your current version of the product will not even be accepted. So now let's talk about some ways on how to keep your ACR up to date in an efficient way. So the best way, as everyone knows, is to start including accessibility into your product development lifecycle instead of having it as an afterthought. When you plan for accessibility from the beginning, you are going to save a ton of time and money because there'll be less accessibility fixes later on, so less remediation to do, and you can meet your target standards much faster. Also, as part of this, it's a good idea, as Justine mentioned, to monitor the accessibility of your product regularly. This way, if you run into accessibility issues, you can fix them right away. So eventually, when there are significant changes to your product's accessibility, you can capture them in an updated ACR. In some cases, there may be value in creating separate ACRs for different areas of the product. I'll give you an example. Some LMS platforms offer different user experiences for administrators compared to general users. So if there's a separate ACR for the general user section and a separate one for the administrator section, and let's say some feature changes were made to the general user interface, you only need to update the ACR for the general user part. So this saves the trouble of updating the document for the entire experience. So these are some of the tips to make sure that your ACR is current and updated. With that, I'll hand it back to John.
Thank you, Ritu and Justine. So just keep in mind that accessibility is the ultimate goal here, and people with disabilities. So really, it's all about people. It may seem sometimes like the VPAT format is a checkbox that you've got to check in order to be able to make a sale. But it really is about whether a person with a disability can use your product and service. So access is the goal, but we understand that accessibility is a journey and that you may need a roadmap to get to full accessibility. So when the first time you get your product evaluated and you get a conformance report, it may not be fully conforming. Many agencies are able to buy products that are not fully conformant as long as they meet their needs. But many will want to know when you're going to fix those issues. They want a roadmap, a timeline of when those issues will be addressed and when the product will be fully conformant. So their employees and customers with disabilities can use the product and service. And so they will likely ask you for you to make commitments if they are serious about accessibility. Other times, people are just happy to get a VPAT, even if it's not perfect. They just need it. But ultimately, it's about people, and that's why we're doing this, to make things more available and to empower people to live their best lives. Next, let's talk about some frequently asked questions that we get from our customers, and I will pass it back over to Justine and Ritu to share some of the questions that we get.
Thank you. So we've compiled a few questions that we frequently get from customers. So the first one is, how do I get a clean VPAT, which is a VPAT that has all supports for the conformance level? And so first, you want to consider that if a product supports a WCAG success criteria, that means that it is fully accessible. It doesn't have any blockers or any issues at the time that the VPAT was authored. So that is usually it's usually the result of rounds of remediation, of fixing the issues that are found in the initial audit, and then like validating that it has in fact fixed the accessibility issues that were found. So for us, usually we'll audit a product, we'll give the findings. And so for clients who it's very important for them to get as many supports as they want, they will go and they will try to fix certain aspects where, if they're getting like that the keyboard partially supports, they'll go in and they'll try to, they'll make sure that all the functionality can be accomplished with the keyboard. But they'll fix it, they'll submit it back to us, we'll validate that it actually fixed the accessibility problem, and then move on and author the VPAT. So the key to getting a VPAT that has all supports is making sure that there aren't any accessibility violations in your product. So that means that if, for example, there's a issue with contrast across multiple screens of your product, and you fix it in all of them except for one, it's still not going to have supports because that issue is still present in your product. So be mindful too that when you're going through and fixing accessibility issues, it's through the entirety of your product. Another question that we get a lot is, can I claim an exception? And so this is interesting because first, certain WCAG success criteria have very rare situations where an exception may be made under very specific situations. So the vast majority of time, though, that people are trying to get an exception, the products don't qualify for it. Because typically people are asking for an exception because there's a limitation within their product, like they're using a third-party plugin that is inaccessible, or the framework that the product was built on has some sort of issue that the dev team can't remediate it. It's just a blocker, they can't remediate it. The issue there is that the issue isn't in the functionality, it's within that third-party plugin or that framework. So, like, for example, like if a way exists to make it accessible, you're not going to qualify for the exception. So like, for example, when we test drag and drop functionality, very often it's inaccessible. So that's going to violate 2.1.1 keyboard, the success criteria. And so sometimes clients want to claim an exception because however they're implementing this, they can't fix. But we've helped many clients make their drag and drop functionality accessible and get it to that point. So it is possible to have accessible drag and drop functionality. So it's not going to qualify for an exception because it can be done. So basically, most likely, vast majority of the time, your product's not going to qualify for an exception. So focus on making your product accessible. And I'm going to pass it over to Ritu.
Thank you, Justine. So a common question we receive from client is, do I need a VPAT for my website or product? As John mentioned earlier, the V in the VPAT stands for voluntary, which means it's up to you if you want to have a VPAT for your product or not. There are no legal requirements to have a VPAT. With that said, if your website or your product will be used in sectors which are directly or indirectly funded by the federal government, you most likely will be requested a VPAT. I usually say, even if your website is not required to have an ACR, it's a good practice to have it. Why? Because it can help you gain an edge over your competitors. It makes your company stand out from others and attract more customers and more business for you. Another reason for having it is, let's say you're trying to sell your product to a company that cares about accessibility. In that case, they'll want to see proof that your product is accessible. And of course, you lower the chance of getting into legal trouble. So overall, you're not required to have one, but it's a good idea to have one. In a similar vein, another question that we get is, I have a VPAT. Do I need to post it on my website? The short answer is, it's up to you. You are not required to post your ACR on your website or share it publicly. You can keep it private and share when someone requests it. However, there are benefits to sharing it on your website. It shows that you know about the problems your product might have for people with disabilities, and that you are serious about making your product accessible for everyone. I've seen big companies like Google, Adobe, and many others. They publish their ACRs online for their product. So ultimately, the decision to share your ACR publicly or keep it private is entirely yours. And it reminds me of another question that Justin was mentioning about third-party plugins. People often wonder if they should include them in their ACR. And the response is yes. If you're using a third-party plugin or app and it has accessibility issue, you have to report that in your ACR. Whether you have developed the entire product yourself or you use some third-party plugins, you are fully responsible for the accessibility of whatever components you end up using in your product. So if you look in WCAG, if you look in section 508, there are no exceptions for third-party content. So it's very important to list them so that the users can get a full picture of your product's accessibility. Justine, do you have any other frequently asked questions?
Yes, I have one last one. So another question we get is, I need an ACR right away for an RFP or proposal. Can I get one? And of course, we can absolutely help with getting an ACR, an accessibility conformance report. But many people don't realize it's a larger process than just authoring the document, like I was talking about earlier. It's an entire process that goes into it, because first, the product has to be audited, and that takes time to accomplish. And then if a lot of times, like I mentioned, if we author the VPAT from there and skip over the remediation and fixing of issues, a lot of time clients will get their ACR and decide that if their team takes the time to go fix the issues, they could have a better looking ACR with more supports and partially supports. And eliminate the does not support and that stuff. So then that's going to add in the time it takes for the customer's team to go in, fix the issues. Then they send it back to us and we verify that, yes, the updates did fix the accessibility issues, or maybe they didn't. So basically, the time it will take to get your product to a place where you can have a favorable ACR tends to take more time than people initially estimate it will. So if you think that you may have the need for an ACR in the future, start the process now. This way, if you're asked for it, you don't have to scramble. It's already prepared and you can share it with the prospective buyer. And so next up, John is going to take us through the key takeaways, and then we're going to go into our Q&A session. So we have a number of questions that have been submitted. Please keep them coming. It's always good to answer questions. So I'll give it to you, John.
Great. Thank you, Justine and Ritu. So let's talk about the key takeaways and be proactive. Being proactive is really important. And I highlight what Ritu said is that if you have third-party components, if you have frameworks that you're using that are created by someone else, ask your third-party vendors, ask your vendors for accessibility, ask them for a conformance report, and you need to work with them to address those accessibility issues if you're using their products and your products. So that's really an important aspect of being proactive. Create that roadmap that we talked about to address those issues. What you don't want to have happen is that you weren't planning for accessibility in your roadmap, and you have some goals, and all of a sudden you need to drop everything and focus on accessibility, and you have to put everything else on the sidelines. And so you don't want to be in that situation. So if you think about it proactively and have it planned out, then you will be able to work on many of your initiatives and reach your goals. And then, as mentioned earlier, update your ACR on a regular basis and use your ACRs to gain a competitive advantage. So it's a great opportunity to unlock opportunities where other companies may not be conformant or may not be thinking about accessibility. So there's some opportunities for business in those areas. I know we're getting a little bit close on time, so I want to make sure we have time to answer your thoughtful questions. So let's jump over to the Q&A.
Sure. So I have the questions pulled up. So the first question is, my organization is still using VPAT 2.4 because the plan to adopt WCAG 2.2 is to be addressed at the end of this year. Is it safe to continue using this version, or do you recommend to update to VPAT 2.5 from now, even when not all of the new WCAG 2.2 requirements are met?
So I'll be happy to jump in on that. So it really depends on your customers' needs. So if you think, I would think about your customers and what they may be asking for. And if your customers don't need that, it's probably okay for now, but you should be thinking about WCAG 2.2. You should be planning to meet that because you're probably going to need that. So really it's just having a discussion with your customers, understanding your markets. If you're selling into healthcare space in the US or public entities, the state and local governments, I just read that Minnesota just went to WCAG 2.1. Other states are just going to 2.2. So just be mindful of what the state laws are out there and your market. So you may be okay, but start planning in case you have that need.
Thank you, John. Next question is, I get a lot of questions regarding a WCAG certificate to show compliance or conformance. Is there such a thing, or is the VPAT the best document to show conformance?
Sure. So there is no formal body that certifies for accessibility at this time. The EU Accessibility Act, as mentioned, coming into force in 2025. In the EU, they're likely to do some market surveillance and do some testing under the Ontarians Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. They actually do some validation testing. The government does some testing as well to make sure people are actually meeting what they say they do. And so it's certainly possible that those could be the cases that you could be monitored or people could be looking, but there is no formal certification. So what we would recommend is, based on your needs, if you're selling your product, you probably want an ACR. We can also do other things. We can create letters of governance, so we can describe our partnership. If you're working with LevelAccess, we can describe how we're working with you as a partner. We can also create letters of progress showing that you're working with us, you've done evaluations, you've remediated issues, and we're working back and forth together. That's a letter of progress. And we can also do other potential letters of conformance and those types of things. Some of our customers come to us after getting a lawsuit, and we can assist them in those processes as well. So there's some other things we can offer if need be.
Thank you. Next is, do you know if Canada is going to require conformance to the EN 301-549?
Right, you may be speaking about the Accessible Canada Act, and so there's a lot of work that's being done on standards there, the Accessible Standards Canada, and what standards they're going to be requiring for accessibility. And you may be saying, well, WCAG, why wouldn't you just do WCAG? As I mentioned earlier, the European standard in Section 508 go beyond web content. They cover things like mobile apps and hardware. And so countries are choosing to use that standard because it covers more type of technology. And so I think that's something that they're looking at. Those efforts are ongoing. I don't want to speak to where that is, but that process is in place. I will say that the European standard was adopted by in Australia, and it was also adopted in India as a standard with some additional things regarding languages as well. So it is being adopted by other nations. So certainly that's not that's possible that they would consider doing that.
Thank you. And another question is, what determines the delineation of products, meaning multiple products? For example, if you have a platform with mobile and web experiences, are those treated as separate products?
Sure. So we would generally recommend having separate ACRs for the mobile and mobile native apps and the website being a separate ACR. You may also want separate ACRs for different experiences. So sometimes, for example, we have customers that may have a customer-facing portal and they may have a employee-facing portal. So they may choose to focus accessibility first on the customer-facing and get their VPAT on the customer-facing one. And then they may still need to make the employee-facing one accessible, right? Because as employees with disabilities, if they're the person who they're selling into it requires it. And so they may want to put that in a separate VPAT. And that's actually helpful because that way you can more clearly know, okay, if there are issues, they apply to this particular type of user on this feature. And I think it's helpful to split out ACRs in that way. I don't know if Ritu or anyone has anything to add to that.
I would say if you have mobile apps and you have different iOS and Android apps, we would recommend that you create separate ACRs for your iOS version and a separate one for your Android version.
Great. Okay, well, I think we need to wrap up. That's been a great set of questions, and thank you everyone for attending. I will display our contact information so you can get in touch with us. My email is john.avila@LevelAccess. That's JON.AVILA@LevelAccess.com. Ritu's is RITU.JAIN@LevelAccess, and Justine's is JUSTINE.BERRETTA@LevelAccess.com. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll be providing a recording of this afterwards as soon as it is available. And thank you everyone for joining us today.